Stay with me, because what happened in that room rewrote everything people thought they knew about power. The sound wasn't loud, not really, but it cut through the marble hall like something final, something that made conversations stop mid-sentence and glasses pause halfway to lips. And in that suspended second, Emily Carter didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe the way she had been just moments before. Her hand resting instinctively over the gentle curve of her 7-month pregnancy, as if her body understood before her mind did that something irreversible had just taken place. And across from her stood Daniel Whitmore, the man whose name carried weight in boardrooms from New York to San Francisco, a man who had built a 9-figure empire before turning 40, a man who knew exactly how to control a room. Until now, until this moment that would later be replayed millions of times, analyzed frame by frame, whispered about in circles that once protected him. Because what people didn't know yet, what no one in that polished, high-ceilinged space could have guessed, was that this wasn't the beginning of Emily's collapse. It was the exact second her story began to turn, though at first glance, she looked like every version of quiet they expected her to be, dressed simply, standing still while Vanessa Blake, elegant, sharp, perfectly composed, watched from just behind Daniel's shoulder with the kind of smile that suggested she believed the outcome had already been decided, and maybe, up until that second, it had been, because Emily had spent the last 3 years becoming smaller in ways no one could measure, giving up her career, her voice, her sense of direction, all in the name of supporting a man whose success seemed to grow in direct proportion to her silence. And if you had asked anyone in that room 10 minutes earlier, they would have described her as fortunate, lucky even, married into wealth, living a life most people only imagined. But luck has a way of shifting when truth steps into the light. And right then, even as the tension thickened and the air seemed to hold its breath, there was something else, something subtle but undeniable, watching, recording, waiting, a quiet presence hidden in plain sight. Because while Daniel believed he controlled every narrative, every outcome, every perception, there were details he had overlooked, people he had underestimated, and decisions he had made months ago that were about to circle back with precision he couldn't anticipate. And Emily, still standing there, still silent, slowly lifted her gaze, not with anger, not with fear, but with a kind of clarity that didn't belong to the woman everyone thought they knew. And somewhere deep in that moment, beneath the polished floors and the rehearsed appearances, the balance had already begun to shift, even if no one else could see it yet, even if Daniel himself mistook her stillness for weakness. Because sometimes the most dangerous transformation doesn't announce itself with noise or chaos. Sometimes it looks exactly like this, quiet, controlled, and just seconds away from changing everything. Daniel was the first to move. But even that movement carried a fraction too much hesitation for a man known for absolute control, his jaw tightening, as if recalculating something invisible, while the room slowly began to breathe again. Conversations not resuming, but shifting into quiet observation, the kind that turns ordinary people into witnesses without warning. And Vanessa, sensing the subtle fracture in his composure, stepped slightly forward, her voice smooth and measured as she attempted to reclaim the atmosphere, making a light remark that sounded rehearsed, almost practiced, yet it landed differently now, thinner, less convincing, because attention had already shifted away from her and locked onto Emily, who still had not spoken, her silence stretching long enough to become its own presence, something that made people uncomfortable in a way they could not quite explain. And when she finally did move, it was not dramatic, not sudden, just a small adjustment of her posture as she straightened her shoulders, her hand still resting over her abdomen in a gesture that felt both protective and grounding. And in that moment it became clear that whatever had just happened had not broken her. It had clarified something, sharpened a line that could not be unseen, and Daniel noticed it too, though he could not name it, his voice lowering as he spoke her name with a tone that suggested authority but carried an undercurrent of uncertainty, as if he expected her to respond the way she always had before, to soften, to explain, to restore the balance he depended on. But Emily did not offer him that. Instead, she looked at him fully for the first time that evening, not searching, not pleading, simply seeing, and it was a look that removed something from him, something subtle but essential, because power, once questioned, never returns in the same form. And somewhere near the edge of the room, unnoticed by most, a man in a dark suit shifted his stance slightly, his attention fixed not on Daniel or Vanessa but on Emily, his presence blending into the background with deliberate precision. And if anyone had been watching closely, they might have recognized the pattern, the quiet coordination that does not happen by accident. But no one was watching that closely, not yet, because all eyes remained on the center of the room where the unspoken tension continued to build. And then Emily did something unexpected. She took a single step forward, closing a distance that had not been physical until that second. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying just enough volume to be heard without demanding it. The kind of voice that does not need to compete because it knows it will be listened to. And she said, only a few words, simple, precise, but they landed with a weight that shifted the atmosphere again, not because of what they revealed, but because of what they implied, because beneath those words was a certainty, a quiet confidence that suggested this moment was not the climax of her story, but the opening move of something much larger, something already in motion long before anyone in that room realized they were part of it. And Daniel, for the first time in years, found himself without an immediate response, his usual certainty interrupted by a realization he could not fully articulate, that whatever he believed he controlled had already begun to move beyond his reach. And Emily, without waiting for acknowledgement, without seeking permission, turned slightly, her gaze shifting past him towards something unseen, something approaching, and though no one else understood why, a subtle unease began to ripple through the room, the kind that precedes a revelation no one is prepared for. The unease did not arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like a shift in temperature that people could feel but could not immediately explain. And then the sound came, not loud, not dramatic, just the distinct echo of measured footsteps crossing polished marble, each step controlled, deliberate, drawing attention without asking for it. And one by one, heads turned toward the entrance as a tall man in a dark tailored suit moved into view, his presence quiet yet unmistakably authoritative, the kind of presence that did not need introduction because it carried its own gravity. And Emily did not look surprised, not even slightly, her eyes already fixed in that direction as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. While Daniel followed the movement a second later, his expression tightening again, not in recognition at first, but in irritation, the instinctive reaction of someone unused to interruption. Yet that irritation faded quickly as realization began to settle in, because this was not just anyone walking into his carefully controlled environment. This was Lucas Carter, and the name alone carried weight in circles Daniel preferred to avoid, a man known not for public appearances but for outcomes, the kind that did not make headlines until it was too late to change them. And as Lucas approached, the subtle shift in the room became undeniable. Conversations died completely now, replaced by a silence that felt intentional, almost expectant, as if everyone present understood on some instinctive level that they were no longer watching a private disagreement, but the unfolding of something much larger. And Lucas stopped a few feet from Emily, not touching her, not rushing, just standing there with a calm that felt practiced, his eyes scanning her quickly, assessing, confirming, before finally turning toward Daniel with a look that held no emotion at all, which somehow made it heavier than anger ever could. And when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, carrying the kind of authority that did not rely on volume. And he did not ask questions, he stated facts, simple, direct, each word landing with precision that made interruption impossible. And Daniel, who had built his reputation on never being caught off guard, found himself searching for footing that was no longer there. Because whatever narrative he had prepared, whatever version of events he believed he could manage, it did not include this. It did not include someone who already knew more than he was willing to admit. And Vanessa, sensing the shift even more sharply than anyone else, took a small step back without realizing it, her confidence cracking just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath the surface. While Emily remained still, her presence now anchored in a way that had nothing to do with the room or the people inside it. Because this moment, this exact intersection of silence and revelation, was not spontaneous. It was the result of choices made weeks ago, calls placed quietly, evidence gathered patiently, and decisions that had been building toward this point with quiet inevitability. And then Lucas reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, not with urgency, but with the same steady control. And when he brought his hand back into view, it was not the object itself that shifted the atmosphere. It was the understanding of what it represented, because whatever Daniel had believed was hidden, whatever he thought was safely buried beneath layers of influence and reputation, was now no longer contained. And as Lucas placed it calmly on the nearest surface, without raising his voice, without making a scene, the room seemed to close in around the truth that was about to surface. And Emily, for the first time since everything began, allowed herself the smallest breath of release. Not relief, not yet, but the recognition that the balance had already tipped, and there was no turning it back. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire room had silently agreed not to be the first to react, and Daniel's eyes dropped to the object resting on the polished surface, his mind working faster than his expression could hide, calculating possibilities, dismissing some, clinging to others, because whatever Lucas had placed there was not supposed to exist in this space. Not here, not now, and certainly not in front of witnesses who were already beginning to understand that something irreversible was unfolding, and Lucas did not rush the moment. He let it breathe. Let the weight of uncertainty settle into every corner of the room before he spoke again, his tone unchanged, steady, controlled, as if this were simply another step in a process that had been carefully designed long before tonight. And when he finally addressed Daniel directly, he did not accuse, he did not raise his voice, he simply outlined what had already been verified: dates, transactions, patterns that formed a picture too precise to dismiss, and each word tightened the invisible pressure surrounding Daniel. Because this was not speculation, this was structure, evidence that had been collected with patience and intention. And for the first time, Daniel's confidence faltered in a way that could not be disguised. His usual responses delayed by a fraction of a second too long, his posture shifting just enough to signal that control was slipping beyond recovery. While Vanessa's composure fractured further, her gaze flickering between the two men, searching for an opening that no longer existed, because the narrative she had relied on was dissolving in real time, replaced by something she did not understand and could not influence. And Emily watched all of it without interruption, her stillness no longer passive but deliberate, because this was not about confrontation, it was about exposure, the kind that does not need force to be effective, only truth delivered at the exact moment it cannot be ignored. And somewhere in the background, a quiet murmur began to build, not loud enough to interrupt, but present enough to confirm that the room had shifted from observation to realization. People no longer guessing, but recognizing that whatever reputation Daniel had constructed was now under scrutiny he could not control, and Lucas, without looking away, reached again into his jacket, this time producing something smaller, something almost ordinary in appearance. Yet the effect was immediate, because the significance was not in the object itself but in what it contained. And as he set it down beside the first, he allowed just enough silence to follow for the implication to settle fully, for Daniel to understand before anyone else needed to, that this was no longer a private matter, that what had been hidden was now documented, preserved, and ready to be seen beyond this room. And that realization landed harder than any raised voice ever could, because it meant there was no negotiation left, no version of events that could be reshaped or redirected, only the truth moving forward with its own momentum. And Emily, feeling that shift as clearly as anyone, slowly lowered her hand from her abdomen, not because she felt less protective, but because she no longer needed to brace herself against uncertainty, her posture aligning with something steadier, something resolved. And when she finally spoke again, her voice remained calm, but now it carried a clarity that reached every corner of the room, not asking for acknowledgement, not demanding attention, simply stating what was already understood, that this moment was not the end of anything but the beginning of accountability. And Daniel, standing there with every advantage he once held slipping quietly out of reach, realized too late that control is not lost all at once. It is taken piece by piece, until there is nothing left to hold on to. Daniel tried to speak, but the words did not come with the same certainty they once had, his voice catching just enough to reveal what everyone in the room was beginning to understand, that the man who had always dictated outcomes was now reacting instead of controlling, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed everything. Because people do not need confirmation when they can sense imbalance, and now it was undeniable, and Vanessa, standing just behind him, felt it more sharply than anyone. Her posture tightening, her expression carefully composed but no longer effortless, because the confidence she had relied on came from proximity to power, and that power was no longer stable. It was slipping in ways she could not predict, and Emily saw it, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with clarity, the kind that comes when illusion finally dissolves. And for the first time in years, she was not reacting to Daniel's presence. She was observing it, measuring it, recognizing it for what it truly was without the distortion she had once carried. And that recognition gave her something far more dangerous than anger. It gave her distance, and Lucas, still standing between them without physically positioning himself as a barrier, shifted his attention slightly, not away from Daniel but outward, as if acknowledging that this moment had already expanded beyond the four of them, beyond the polished walls, beyond the carefully curated environment Daniel had built to protect his image, and that expansion became visible when one of the guests, a man who had remained silent until now, stepped back instinctively, creating space, not out of fear but out of awareness, the kind that signals a turning point no one wants to be caught inside of. And the quiet murmur grew again, not louder, but more certain, conversations beginning in low tones, names being recognized, implications forming faster than they could be contained, and Daniel heard it, even if he pretended not to, because reputation is not lost in a single moment, it unravels in layers. And this was the first thread being pulled in full view, and he straightened slightly, attempting to reclaim something, anything, his voice returning with a measured tone that aimed to reframe the situation, to suggest misunderstanding, to imply that what was being presented lacked context. But the effort landed differently now, because context only matters when doubt exists, and doubt had already been replaced by structure, by the quiet certainty Lucas had introduced piece by piece, and Emily did not interrupt him. She did not challenge him directly. She simply listened, allowing his words to fill the space just long enough for their weight to reveal themselves. And when he finished, expecting resistance, expecting emotion, expecting anything that would restore the dynamic he understood, she responded in the same calm, steady voice she had used before, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. And she did not argue. She did not defend. She simply acknowledged what had been said, and then, with a precision that left no room for reinterpretation, she redirected the moment back to what mattered, to what could not be undone or explained away. And that was when the final shift became visible, not in a dramatic gesture, but in something quieter, something more permanent, because Daniel's silence this time was not strategic. It was empty, the kind that follows when every available option has already been accounted for. And Emily, standing there with a steadiness that no longer needed reinforcement, realized that the outcome had already been decided long before this night began, and all that remained now was for everyone else to see it unfold in real time. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, layered with the quiet understanding that something irreversible had already taken place, and Daniel felt it settling around him like a pressure he could not deflect, because for the first time in years, there was no immediate path forward, no strategy ready to deploy, no leverage left to pull the moment back under his control. And that realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in through the smallest details, the way people no longer looked to him for cues, the way the room had subtly shifted its alignment, the way even Vanessa had stepped half a pace further back without meaning to, creating distance where once there had been certainty, and Emily noticed all of it. Not as someone seeking validation, but as someone finally seeing the full picture without distortion, and there was a strange calm in that clarity, a steadiness that replaced the uncertainty she had carried for far too long, because now nothing needed to be guessed, nothing needed to be interpreted, everything was visible in its simplest form, and Lucas, standing quietly, allowed the moment to unfold without interference, his role no longer to introduce facts, but to let them exist in the open, where they could not be reshaped or minimized. And that was when the final layer began to surface, not through confrontation but through recognition, as one of the guests near the far side of the room took a cautious step closer, his eyes moving between the documents on the table and Daniel's face, connecting pieces that had once seemed unrelated, and then another followed, and another, not approaching aggressively but drawn by the gravity of what was being revealed, because truth, once visible, has a way of pulling attention toward it without invitation. And Daniel saw it happening, felt it happening, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his expression that had never been there before, not fear exactly, but the awareness that control was no longer an option, and he adjusted his stance again, his voice returning with a different tone this time, quieter, more measured, as if attempting to slow the momentum rather than redirect it. But the shift came too late, because momentum, once established, does not respond to hesitation. It moves forward with its own force. And Emily did not need to say anything more to understand that. She did not need to press further or demand acknowledgement, because the outcome was already unfolding in front of her, piece by piece, in ways that could not be undone. And as she looked around the room, she saw it reflected in the faces of those watching, the shift from curiosity to comprehension, from observation to conclusion, and in that moment, something inside her settled completely, not in victory, not in relief, but in certainty, the kind that does not require reaction because it is already complete. And she took a slow breath, steady and controlled, her posture unchanged yet entirely different from the woman who had stood there at the beginning of the night, because this version of her did not need to prove anything, did not need to fight for space or recognition. She simply existed within the truth that had finally come to light. And as Lucas reached forward once more, not to introduce anything new but to close the distance between what had been presented and what could no longer be denied, the room seemed to narrow around that final realization that nothing said from this point forward would change what had already been seen. And Daniel, standing at the center of it all, understood too late that the moment he had dismissed as insignificant had become the one he could never take back. It did not end with a single reaction. It unfolded in layers, quiet but undeniable, as the room adjusted itself to a new reality that no one had prepared for, and Daniel could feel it slipping through his fingers in ways that no statement or correction could reverse, because what had been revealed was no longer confined to documents or quiet conversations. It had become perception, and perception, once changed, does not return to its original form. And he stood there, still composed on the surface, still holding the posture of a man who had spent years mastering control. But beneath that surface something had shifted permanently, something that even he could not disguise anymore. And Emily saw it clearly, not with satisfaction, but with a calm recognition that this moment was no longer about confrontation, it was about conclusion. And she allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for everyone present to absorb what had already been decided without needing it spoken aloud. And around them the subtle movements continued, people stepping back, creating distance not out of fear, but out of understanding, because no one wanted to be positioned too close to something that was unraveling so publicly, so definitively. And Vanessa, who had once stood with effortless confidence, now found herself repositioning again, her gaze lowering briefly before she caught it, her composure still intact, but no longer convincing, because confidence cannot exist without stability, and stability had disappeared from the moment Lucas entered the room. And now even she could feel that there was no version of events left that would return things to the way they had been. And Lucas remained exactly where he was, not advancing, not retreating, simply present, his role complete in a way that did not require further action, because everything that needed to be introduced had already been placed into the open. And from this point forward, it would move on its own, beyond this room, beyond this night, beyond anyone's ability to contain it. And that was when the final realization settled fully into the space, not as a dramatic shift, but as a quiet acceptance that the outcome was no longer in question. And Daniel, for the first time since the beginning of the evening, did not attempt to speak, did not attempt to redirect or redefine, because even he understood now that there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to manage, only the consequences of what had already been set in motion. And Emily, feeling that certainty settle within her, made a decision that did not require announcement, did not need validation. She simply turned, not abruptly, not with hesitation, but with a calm finality that carried more weight than any argument ever could. And as she took her first step away from the center of the room, something else shifted, not in the environment, but in the perception of everyone watching. Because this was no longer the image of someone walking away from a loss. This was the quiet exit of someone who had already reclaimed everything that mattered, and the space she left behind felt different instantly, as if the balance of the room had been anchored by her presence and now had to readjust without it. And Daniel remained where he stood, surrounded not by confrontation but by the absence of it, which somehow made the outcome more complete, more final, because there was nothing left to argue against, no conflict to engage with, only the reality that had been revealed, in full view. And as Emily continued forward without looking back, without pausing, without needing to confirm anything further, the distance between who she had been and who she was now became unmistakable, and for everyone who witnessed it, that quiet transformation would remain far longer than anything that had been said. The door did not make a sound when it closed behind her, but everyone felt it, a quiet final note that seemed to settle into the room long after Emily Carter had disappeared from view. And for a few seconds no one moved, not because they were unsure of what had happened, but because they understood it too clearly, and clarity, when it arrives all at once, has a way of stilling even the most restless spaces. And Daniel remained exactly where she had left him, his posture still upright, his expression still controlled, but the foundation beneath it had shifted in a way that could not be restored, because what had been taken from him was not just authority in that moment, it was the perception of it, and perception, once broken, does not rebuild on command. And around him the room began to change in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, people no longer standing as close. Conversations resuming in low tones, but never quite reaching the same ease they had before, because now every word carried awareness, every glance carried context, and even those who had once aligned themselves with him found reasons to step slightly aside, to create distance that could later be explained if necessary. And Vanessa, who had not moved for several seconds after Emily's exit, finally shifted her weight. Her composure still present, but thinner now, less certain, as if it required effort to maintain. And when she looked toward Daniel, it was not with the same confidence as before, but with a question she could not voice, because the answer was already visible, and Lucas, standing just beyond them, did not linger for acknowledgement or reaction, his role complete in the same quiet way it had begun. And after one final glance toward the door Emily had walked through, he turned and left without a word, his departure as controlled and deliberate as his arrival, leaving behind not tension but resolution, the kind that does not need to be reinforced because it has already taken hold. And Daniel exhaled slowly, a movement so slight most would not notice, but it marked something significant, the first visible sign that the night had moved beyond his influence. And he looked down briefly at the surface where the evidence had been placed, not touching it, not moving it, as if even that small action would acknowledge a reality he was not ready to accept. And yet the reality did not require his acceptance to exist. It had already expanded beyond the room, beyond the people present, beyond anything he could contain, and one by one the guests began to disengage, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the quiet understanding that there was nothing more to witness here, because the outcome had already been decided in the only way that mattered, through exposure rather than argument, through truth rather than confrontation. And as the space gradually emptied, the contrast became impossible to ignore. What had begun as a room filled with presence and control now felt hollow, stripped of the energy that had once defined it, and Daniel stood at the center of that absence, not defeated in a visible sense, not broken in a way that could be pointed to, but changed, undeniably and permanently, because some losses do not arrive with noise or collapse, they arrive quietly. In moments like this, where everything appears intact until you realize that what truly mattered is already gone, and somewhere beyond the closed door, Emily walked forward without hesitation, her pace steady, her expression calm, carrying with her not the weight of what had happened, but the certainty of what she had reclaimed. And in that quiet separation, two paths moved in opposite directions, one defined by what had been revealed, and the other by what no longer needed to be proven. The night did not end when the room emptied. It carried forward in ways no one present could fully contain, Because moments like that do not stay where they happen. They move, they spread, they settle into conversations, into decisions, into the quiet recalculations people make when they realize something they once believed is no longer true. And by the time Daniel finally stepped out into the corridor, the world beyond that room had already begun to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the subtle, irreversible ways that define real consequences. And he walked with the same measured pace he had always maintained, his posture still composed, his expression still controlled, but the silence that followed him was different now, no longer respectful, no longer deferential, just observant. And that difference, small as it seemed, marked the beginning of something he could not reverse. And across the city, phones would light up, messages would circulate, questions would form. Where certainty once existed, because information, once released, does not ask permission to travel, it moves on its own. And somewhere in that movement, the version of him that had been carefully constructed over years would begin to unravel, not through confrontation but through awareness, through the quiet understanding that what had been hidden was now visible, and visibility changes everything. And Emily, stepping out into the cool night air, felt none of that weight follow her, because what had been revealed was no longer hers to carry. It belonged to the truth itself, and she moved forward with a steadiness that came not from victory, but from resolution, the kind that settles in when there is nothing left to question, nothing left to prove. And as she walked, the city around her continued as it always had, cars passing, lights shifting, distant sounds blending into a familiar rhythm, and for the first time in a long time, she felt separate from it all in a way that was not isolating, but freeing, as if the noise no longer defined her direction, and behind her, far enough that it no longer mattered, Daniel would continue forward on a path shaped not by what he chose next, but by what had already been set in motion. Because some outcomes are decided long before they become visible, and when they finally surface, they do so with a clarity that leaves no room for revision. And Emily did not look back, not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that required her attention. And that absence, that quiet release, became the final shift in her story, not marked by confrontation or closure, but by the simple act of continuing forward without hesitation. And somewhere between the last echo of that night and the beginning of whatever came next, the balance had fully realigned, not through force, not through argument, but through the quiet, undeniable weight of truth finding its place. And in that stillness, in that calm, the only thing that remained was understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken because it is already known, that some people lose everything they built not in a single moment of collapse, but in the exact second they underestimate the strength of someone they believe they had already broken.